Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. Also at the Voice for Liberty, that's my website, wichitaliberty.org. You'll find Wichita Liberty TV there, show notes for each episode, all the old episodes, and all the other material that I and others produce on wichitaliberty.org almost every day. Well, this week we have Jonathan Williams as our guest. He's the Chief Economist and Vice President for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC as it's called. He works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the state. Prior to joining ALEC, Williams worked at the Tax Foundation, still does a lot of great work there. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, many other leading publications. And Jonathan Williams, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I think this is the fourth appearance, so thank you very much. And co-host Karl, Peterjohn, thank you as well. I know you're here to deliver some talks about Kansas in particular, but before we tackle that, tell us a little bit about ALEC in general, some of the things it does, and what type of success or whatever, or maybe not success, you're seeing in the States.
Well, thanks again for having me back, Bob. It's always good to be here. And I tell you, ALEC is a unique, great organization I've been a part of for more than 10 years now on staff. We've been around for nearly 45 years as an organization. Okay. We believe really in three main principles, as you know: free markets, limited government, and federalism, three of the American guiding principles. And we work with state lawmakers from the 50 state capitals because, after all, we believe that not all the solutions should come from Washington, D.C., and we believe that the states should be these laboratories of democracy, that we can learn from the success and the failures of what's gone on at the state level to produce real free market change for taxpayers. And so I run our Center for State Fiscal Reform and oversee really the tax, budget, pension policy component to what we do, and also now serve as chief economist. But we're really the nation's largest nonpartisan group of state lawmakers. We don't ask for taxpayer dollars like some of our competitor organizations do, which really it makes us, I think, practice what we preach as an organization: free markets, limited government, federalism. That's what we're about.
Now, I know Karl knows the answer to this question. He's quite a scholar, but I always get confused as to what federalism means. Could you brief me and our viewers on that a little bit, please?
Well, that's a great question because it depends who you ask. In Washington these days, some people hear the term federalism and they think that means the federal government taking over everything more, right? And so federalism, properly understood, I think goes back to the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is those powers not given directly to the federal government should be reserved for the states, but even as importantly, or more importantly, the people of the states. And so that proper balance between a federal government that oversees big things that they need to oversee and protecting life, liberty, and property, and then the state government's really filling in and doing much more of the governing, I think was the original idea. And I think we'd all be better off if more decisions are made closer to the people that can be influential in making better public policy happen. So that's why we're big advocates of federalism, and I think our nation needs a little bit more of it.
Now, I know a criticism of ALEC that we often see is that it is a bill mill, and by that critics allege that ALEC writes bills and just shoves them down the throat of state legislators in a secretive way. But I've looked at ALEC website, and those bills are right on the website.
If by secretive our critics mean this thing called the internet, then maybe we're guilty as charged. But the idea is, as you and I have talked about, Bob, is our 800 or so ALEC model policies are all on the internet at alec.org for the entire world to see. And we believe they should be judged on the merits of their ideas, whether they're our model policy or the model policy of other more liberal organizations. There's so many organizations that come up with best practices, and that at the end of the day is what model policy is all about. Let's not reinvent the wheel every time we go about talking about policy.
Exactly. So ALEC is not alone in in providing model legislation. There are others like the State Information Exchange and some others that have a different point of view. And then also, people have asked me always, is there something like ALEC but for local government? And recently ALEC has started something like that.
For many years, we've been hearing that very same question, Bob, and that is what kind of resources exist for county and city elected officials across the country. And up until recently, there wasn't much from the free market perspective, but that's why ALEC came in and created the American City County Exchange, or ACE, which is an organization devoted to bringing these very same best practices and free market principles to those men and women at the state and local level, or at the local and county level, that want to pursue good pro-taxpayer reforms. And so very excited. In the early stages, we've seen some great growth in that program.
And I can imagine that's quite a challenge because there's only 50 states, or 57 depending who you ask, but how many cities and counties are there, and they operate under very different systems, types of governments very often, so that's quite a challenge. So Jonathan Williams, we're going to take a commercial break for a moment. We'll get to you, Karl, in just a moment. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Karl Peterjohn, our guest, Jonathan Williams of ALEC. So, Karl, you had a question about the local government aspect.
Well, not only local government, Bob, but the question I'd have for Jonathan, ALEC it couldn't exist if you didn't have elected officials participating in it. Can you talk for a minute about how many legislators and total elected officials are involved in the organization?
So that's a great question. There's about 2,000 policymakers that are involved in ALEC as an organization, and it's a great group. It's a nonpartisan group. We've got Republicans and Democrats and independents all that have been involved with ALEC and continue to be involved with ALEC in all 50 state capitals. And we've also got about 100 members of the current United States Congress who are our alumni members, who then served, now moved up or down, or however you want to see that, to Congress after they served in one of the state legislators.
Well, let me follow it up, because ALEC has done an incredibly valuable resource with the publication of Rich States, Poor States, and you've done it for a number of years. Could you talk about that publication and the role that it plays, in my view, a critical role for providing a benchmark or yardstick for measuring what's going on with in all 50 states and the District of Columbia?
Well, thanks, Karl. I appreciate that. It's a project I've worked on now for 10 years since I came to ALEC, and it was really all about how do we create an environment of economic competition between states. We know that the states are laboratories of democracy. Whether they like it or not, they're competing with each other every single day for new business investment, new job creation, new population growth as Americans vote with their feet. And so Art Laffer and Steve Moore and I decided to put together this research to say, let's rank the states based on what we know matter for economic growth, the policies that work and the policies that don't in some cases, and then take a look at how the states stack up against each other and give state lawmakers a barometer for how their state compares, and then be able to track those changes and keep a consistent time series to say, for better or for worse, what's happening in the states, and how does Kansas and other states stack up.
What's interesting is Rich States, Poor States has a backward-looking ranking, but also then a forward-looking ranking based upon policies. And I think in the economic performance, Kansas is kind of near the middle of the states. We were doing very well in the forward-looking, but we've fallen back in a few years. I should say the most recent edition of Rich States, Poor States from April doesn't include anything that happened in this year's Kansas legislative session.
And that's the key point right there, is we've seen Kansas really have a boomerang effect almost in its rankings, from starting out when we were all talking about the need for tax reform to make Kansas more competitive, because Kansas has lagged the nation for decades in a lot of key measures. Then when pro-growth growth tax cuts happened. Kansas moved from the mid-20s to number 11 in economic outlook. And now, after these massive historic tax increases in a very negative way, Kansas is back to almost where it started pre-tax cuts. And so we've seen, if anything, that this big movement has been, some very positive things, and now, of course, taxpayers, I think we can all say we don't want to repeat what happened in the last 6 months again.
Well, the liberal critics and self-described progressives are here in Kansas, in both parties, they like to call themselves moderates, have said, well, wait a minute, the effort to cut taxes that Governor Brownback signed into law that took effect in 2013 has failed. How would rich states, poor states look at that and respond, looking at the data now that we've got roughly 3 years behind us on that? Or 4 years, I should say.
This is something we're hearing nationally. Everyone nationally that doesn't like to cut taxes and wants bigger government is saying, look to Kansas because this was supposedly a failure. What I tell them is that the 10-second answer to that very, very complicated question that we could have several shows on, Bob, is when you cut taxes, you need to cut spending. And you need to make sure that the cost of government doesn't grow too quickly, and you need to make sure that you pay for those things at the state level. States have to balance budgets. Right. Outside of us in Washington, it never do. We just print money in Washington, but states do have to govern that way, and you cannot have a liberal spending plan with a conservative tax plan. And I think that's the way that the lesson that needs to be learned from Kansas. It was not a failure of tax cuts. It was a failure of balancing those good pro-growth tax cuts with spending discipline. And other states have learned that lesson. North Carolina, for instance, is an example in the other direction where they did cut spending and cut taxes, and now they're realizing a real economic boom.
And you know, there was, after June when the legislature passed the tax increase over the governor's veto, there was a flurry of editorials in all sorts of newspapers criticizing the Kansas tax cuts as a failure, and also pointing out this is a lesson for the national government, because it seems like Donald Trump, the president, has proposed some tax cuts, but not very many spending cuts to go along with that.
Well, and that's the lesson as we work with members of this administration in Washington, and I've submitted testimony to the House Ways and Means Committee in D.C. on federal tax reform, is Kansas should be a case study. It should be a case study to show how tax cuts could work if done properly, but it's a case study of implementation, and that the spending reduction and discipline didn't go along with it. And I think there is a lesson to be learned there when it comes to the federal level. Even though we have the ability to print money, we don't have to balance a budget, we do need to live within our means.
Yeah, and Kansas, of course, can't print money, but we can borrow, and we do that. And also we spend down balances, ending balances, rather than starting to reform spending. We've done that too. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break here at Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm still Bob Weeks. He's Karl Peterjohn, our special guest Jonathan Williams of American Legislative Exchange Council. So we had the tax increases in Kansas. Here we have a state representative, Don Heineman, who is a man of some importance. He's the majority leader of the Kansas House of Representatives. And he wrote in an editorial talking about the tax cuts that it was unfortunately the only responsible option available. State government has been cut to the point where there is no reasonable way to reduce spending enough to balance the budget. Jonathan, what do you think about that?
Well, it's patently false, I think, from a perspective of reading some of the studies that have come out from groups like the Kansas Policy Institute, who have come up with many ways to get to a balanced budget without raising a dime of new taxes. And then I always like to come back to the idea of, remember when the legislature brought in the outside consultants at Alvarez and Marcel to come up with the ideas of budget savings. And what did they come up with? Something like $2 billion of budget savings, and how many of those things were implemented?
Yeah. Almost
nothing. Almost zero was implemented out of that. And these are best practices that have saved other states money. So, you know, when I hear this kind of rhetoric coming out of elected officials or pundits and political types that spending has been cut to the bone in Kansas, I almost wonder what planet they're living on, considering all the other options that are out here.
Well, they also talk about the three-legged stool of taxes. That would be property tax, sales tax, and income tax, that we've got to restore the stable three-legged stool. And I always think that's really a ridiculous analogy. I wrote on my site that if we could come up with a fourth way of taxation, and I suggested maybe importing, putting a tariff on imports of Coors beer from Colorado into Kansas, they'd be praising the four-legged chair instead of the three-legged stool. But on a more serious note, there are a lot of states that are missing one of those three legs, and they're getting by just fine.
Well, in some of America's most successful states and booming economies are states like Texas and Florida, for instance, which go without a personal income tax. In rich states, poor states, we always look at the 9 states that don't tax personal income and compare them with the states that have the highest tax rates. And not just this year, not just last year. You go back a decade, you go back 5 decades, and the group of states that goes without a personal income tax, a tax on wage income, those states are always the ones that are outperforming. They're growing. Those are growth states. There's a reason why Americans continue to vote with their feet against high-tax states like California and New York and towards low-tax states or states without income taxes. And so this idea that, it might sound good in an analogy, a three-legged stool, but the practice of the matter is the states without personal income taxes and economizing budgets better than other states, those states are the states that people want to emulate today.
And talking about stability, I actually did some research that income tax is really the most volatile type of tax that there is, especially for corporations, because the economy goes down a little bit, all of a sudden corporations have no income, so they pay no income tax after that.
Well, yeah, first they're most damaging economically based on the academic work that's been done, and secondly, they're most volatile. So relying on that and trying to create a healthy budget, through the boom and bust cycle is next to impossible. I mean, look at California, where Governor Jerry Brown, a liberal Democrat, has just admitted that the California system is too volatile because it relies too much on income taxes. That's Jerry Brown. That's not Jonathan Williams.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Well, let me expand on that for just a second, because we've got a number of states that are in serious financial problem. You've mentioned California. I would put Illinois in the mix, and Illinois, like Kansas, has had a dramatic increase in income, personal and corporate income taxes this year. Can you kind of give us a quick overview on what's happening? We often have, obviously, the hometown perspective, and we're looking at Kansas, but what's going on nationally with the other states, and are there any trends that we ought to be more aware of here that's what's occurring, whether it's in Illinois, California, or anywhere else?
Right. Well, there's a lot of negative stories. This year, 31 states had budget shortfalls. It wasn't just Kansas. There was a widespread piece of it. The weak economic growth at the national level, as well as commodity prices and oil and gas prices, put a lot of states into a defensive mode on how do we get out of there without raising taxes. Illinois is an example that I always like to use today. Is if there's one state to not be like, is do not be like Illinois, and probably Connecticut, throwing that into the mix as well. Be more like North Carolina. That's the short story of it. They've cut taxes aggressively, matched it with spending cuts, had a huge budget surplus, AAA bond rating, paid teachers more because of this extra surplus. I mean, that's the model to look at. Illinois, though, they just raised taxes by 32% on personal income. Illinois has the worst pension problems in America, too. They have an issue now where the pension crisis is so bad it's taking money out of the classroom and putting into pension costs. And so I think it's a good issue to look at if you're a left-leaning person or a right-leaning person. The Illinois example should really scare you with what pension costs have done. And Kansas is not in the situation yet of where Illinois is, but it's headed in that direction absent reforms.
And we have done a little bit of sleight of hand. We borrowed $1 billion to make contributions to the pension fund. So now our pension fund is looking better, but we've got this $1 billion worth of debt over here. And I think Barry Paulson of Colorado talked about how when other states have done that, the legislators and the governor has said, okay, we paid, because we borrowed that money and shored up the pension fund, we can skip making payments this year, and Kansas has done that. So we've really incurred more long-term debt to pay our pension fund, and it's not a good situation. We're going to take our last commercial break here on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl, Peterjohn, and Jonathan Williams of ALEC. So we've had charges that, well, one of the most controversial aspects of the tax cuts in Kansas was the elimination of tax on certain forms of business organization, most notably limited liability corporations. And you had a column a few weeks ago where you addressed this issue that were a lot of businesses in Kansas switching their form of organization just to avoid paying income tax or not?
Right. I mean, that's a big misnomer, is that you had these people trying to game the system and switching to, to small business form versus being a C Corp beforehand or something just to avoid the taxes. And in reality, based on the IRS data that we have, I mean, that did not happen to a large extent, very small extent.
That's interesting because Kansas, as I've seen it, has a relatively high state corporate income tax rate. Mm-hmm. It's over 7% if you have an income. I believe it's over $50,000 or $100,000 of earnings. And I would think that that would be people over time will adjust their tax system, their tax structure to try and maximize their benefit.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just a hurdle to do that too. It's very expensive, obviously, in a lot of cases to change that. And so what we saw, at least early on, since this was in place for such a short period of time, is very few actually game the system that way. But the numbers, as I pointed out in my townhall.com column, was talking really about the issue of where was the job creation. Something like 98% of the job creation after the tax cuts came on the small business side. So we see tax cuts actually did work if they just needed to be given a little bit more time to mature. And we all know that at the start of this process, the idea was not just to have small businesses exempt from income taxes, was the idea that we had all individuals exempt, the March to Zero idea, that everyone should be exempt from income taxes on the individual side. So it was just the idea that they were putting this ahead of the rest of the wage income. And of course, people kind of got into that academic debate of whether that's the right thing to do or not, but at least it did show promise in terms of job creation.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was interesting, while the GDP numbers that have just come out for the first quarter were down, and Kansas was near the bottom. There were a number of our neighboring states that are also been hit by ag and energy challenges, which has been a problem. That were in worse shape than we were. And I know that this is going to probably create a number of PhD theses for a number of students for the coming decades when they compare Kansas and maybe even Illinois and some of the other states with these tax experiments.
Right, and the idea that Kansas cut taxes and that was the reason for the budget shortfall, that's been oversold, and it's not anywhere close to being true because there's all these states around Kansas, as you point out, Karl, that did not cut taxes that are facing very similar situations because of the natural flow of the economy, because of commodity prices and oil and gas.
I think there's a lot of confusion between the state of Kansas budget and the Kansas economy. They're really two separate concepts. They influence each other, no doubt about that. But just because we have we have huge budget deficits at the national level, yet the economy seems to be on the way up. At least that's what they tell us. So, Jonathan, in the couple minutes we have left, the title of some of the talks you're giving here in Kansas are "The Largest Tax Hike in Kansas History, Now What?" So, what is the answer to the now what question?
I think now what is, there needs to be a reset button hit to say that we need leadership to come in the next few years to really fix the mess that's been created and get Kansas back on the path to becoming a more competitive state again. I think Kansas now, looking at the metrics, as I mentioned, Kansas down back into the middle of the pack again, significantly below Oklahoma, significantly below Colorado. Missouri's done some great things in the last year, like become a right-to-work state and cut income taxes this calendar year. Kansas does face the risk of falling behind just by standing still at this point with the neighbors. And of course, that's why we had this whole discussion over how to make Kansas competitive in the first place. So there needs to be a reset button pushed. And what are the steps to address some of these big picture cost issues like pensions and some of the other drivers that if we don't get these cost issues under control, it's going to be very difficult to make Kansas a more competitive state going forward.
Well, our spending trends are such that we have made spending commitments, whether we're talking pension or ongoing expenditures, that this current income tax hike is not going to cover, and we're getting edicts from our judiciary basically saying, we need more spending. It has been the history of this going back over a decade in terms of court rulings. So this taxes do matter, don't they? And in terms of the actions that we're taking now will have significant long-term consequences, I believe, and they could be quite negative for every Kansas citizen.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about they will, unless those things are reversed. But the fundamental piece of it is pensions need to be fixed, and that, with the quasi reforms that were done a couple of years ago, did not get the job done.
Right.
And then secondly is there needs to be a reset when it comes to the legislature allowing the courts to become an appropriation committee and tell them how much needs to be spent. There's a division of powers issue here that the judicial branch cannot take precedent over the legislative and executive branch in Kansas.
And I think, we just really need to have leadership in both the legislature and the state house that really wants to tackle the spending issues. I think we have legislators who've supported tax cuts saying no one ever likes to raise taxes. Well, they say that, but they really do. And they talk about it's courageous to raise taxes. No, it would be courageous to tackle spending in a responsible manner. And we're out of time here, but you talked about a leadership reset. As we know, our Kansas governor is likely to be departing soon for another position. We'll have a new governor, and perhaps that could be the impetus for some change. But we're out of time. So Jonathan Williams, thank you very much for being on Wichita Liberty TV this week. Karl, thank you as well. And we hope to see you again next week.